Thank you, chairs, members of the commission. My name is Stephen Brown. I'm executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Rhode Island. And there are really two particular issues I want to address at today's hearing. The first is one that some of the questions and comments from Representative Ruggiero made that I think is important. I think it's partly a function of the wording of the Constitution itself, but this hearing and the agenda presuppose that there's a constitutional convention, and what it asks for is testimony on what issues should be discussed at that convention. I would strongly encourage the Commission to make clear to the public that testimony is also welcome on the preliminary question of whether there should be a constitutional convention in the first place. This was an issue that I know has been dealt with the previous preparatory commissions. We think it's a legitimate issue for members of the public to be able to raise. The ACLU does oppose the calling of a constitutional convention. I know there are many other individuals and organizations that do that, and I would really think it would be helpful if those individuals and organizations knew that it was appropriate to present that, because otherwise it's fine to come up with a long list of things that people might think are great to have at a convention, but if there are real dangers in the process of a convention itself, that's something that the public needs to consider as well. So I'm not going to spend today talking about why we oppose the calling of a convention, but I hope this commission will consider allowing that testimony and encouraging that testimony at future hearings. But to address the agenda at its face value, which was to discuss topic areas to be included in the Commission's report as possible issues for consideration, I do want to give a list. It's not a list that we support, and it's not a list that you will likely hear from many, if any, of the people who speak at these public hearings, at this one or at the two future ones that you plan to have. But they are issues that are most likely to crop up at a convention. And those issues include such things as constitutional amendments to limit the rights of immigrants, to limit the rights of gays and lesbians, to restrict the right of same-sex marriage if the Supreme Court itself does not uphold it as a constitutional right, to restrict the rights of labor, to restrict the availability of the Federal Affordable Care Act, to divert public aid to private schools, to limit a woman's right to reproductive choice, and to pass constitutional amendments that adversely impact racial minorities. Now, where did that list come from? That's a list of some of the voter referenda that regularly appear and that get voted on by public across the country. And there's no reason, from our view, to doubt that these are also the sort of issues that would crop up at a constitutional convention. In fact, the last two that I mentioned, we have the actual history of dealing with them in Rhode Island in terms of women's right to reproductive freedom and rights of racial minorities. The 1986 Constitutional Convention, which is the last state constitutional convention that has occurred anywhere in the country, approved not one but two constitutional amendments designed to restrict a woman's right to choose, and passed two constitutional amendments that adversely affected racial minorities. So I think those are issues that ought to be on the list if you're preparing a list of possible issues at a convention, but it's also a list that demonstrates to us what the real dangers are of holding a convention. Thank you, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Mr. Brown, did you say 1986 was the last time anywhere in the country that a state has held a constitutional convention? That's correct.
There are 12 or 13 states that have constitutional provisions similar to Rhode Island's, which requires at some periodic basis a question to appear on the ballot as to whether to hold a constitutional convention. Since Rhode Island's convention, there have been, I think, 26 such votes in those 12 or 13 states. And no, there's never been a vote to hold one.
Those are all public votes. Everybody in those states.
Yeah, these are ballots. These are votes just like what will happen here in November. The public goes to the poll and votes whether to hold one, and they have rejected it. Perhaps they learned some things from Rhode Island's convention. I hope we will too.
It sounds then like people all across the country recognize that sometimes constitutional conventions can be a good thing and sometimes they can be a very bad thing, a dangerous thing.
I think that is the lesson that others have learned.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Brown?
What was the result in '86 of those negative issues you just mentioned? Did they pass any? Did they try
Oh,
to
yes.
pass
3 of the 4 passed. What was interesting is that just as we're hearing today, for the 1986 convention, all the talk was about government reform. What ended up being the biggest issue was abortion. As I mentioned, there were 2 amendments dealing with abortion. One of them was voted down. One of them was approved by the voters. The two amendments that adversely impacted the rights of racial minorities were both approved by the voters, one of which was actually overturned by the General Assembly and the voters some 15 or 20 years later, dealing with the right to vote. But 3 of those 4 amendments were approved by the voters.
How many amendments have we had to our Constitution?
Mr. If you could just move your microphone a little closer so that those on TV.
How many amendments have we had to our Constitution since 17 or whenever it was written? Do you know?
Since when it was written?
Yeah.
No, I don't know.
Maybe 0.
No, since the 1986 Constitutional Convention, actually, there have probably been about a dozen or so constitutional amendments that have come out of the General Assembly to the voters.
Thank you.
Senator Hodgson.
Mr. Brown, my follow-up question is to Mr. Deals as well, in terms of the travel of those issues that you cite as your greatest concerns from the 1986 amendments. Can you point to an ongoing harm to the people of Rhode Island from those laws? Or would you say that the systemic safeguards that are in place to review our state constitution and application of the laws mitigated those harms that you're concerned about?
No, I think there absolutely were harms, and there will be harms as a result of these amendments. To take one of them, one of the ones affecting racial minorities had to do with the right to vote. A 1986 constitutional amendment subjected, at that time, individuals who were incarcerated for felonies could not vote. The constitutional amendment did a few things, one of which was to expand the list of those ineligible to vote to include all people on probation or parole for felonies. And in fact, it wasn't until, I believe, 2004 or 2006, this General Assembly approved a constitutional amendment to reverse that. But in between, during that time, there were literally thousands of individuals who lost their right to vote as a result of that. A second one that I think is certainly problematic for the future is the anti-abortion amendment that was approved. As I mentioned, one was not. Another one that was essentially prohibits using our state constitution as a vehicle for protecting reproductive freedom in the event that the federal courts fail to continue with that protection. And looking at the way the federal courts have been ruling recently, I think that loss is a potentially very serious one for those who are concerned about reproductive freedom in the coming years.
Senator. Representative Ruggiero.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, I'm looking at, thanks to Beverly Clay, the Voter Information Handbook from 2004, and the Secretary of State explains the Constitutional Convention, its purpose, and then there's a question that says, how much money will be borrowed? And the answer is the referendum would not authorize any borrowing. To me, the question would be, how much money would a Constitutional Convention cost? So I think the voters need to know, what would that cost the state of Rhode Island? Because obviously, since I serve on House Finance, that money has to come from somewhere, correct?
Absolutely. I think that's a very good point. I know that's something that is on people's minds. It certainly makes sense for this commission to be the one to do some research so that the public is aware in going to the polls in November what the approximate costs will be.
So there are no estimates, even though in 1985 it was $891,000. In 2006 it cost about $2 million, estimating?
I haven't heard of any at this point.
Okay. That's just reading the previous report that was issued.
Yeah, the previous reports did, in fact, look into the issue of cost, and I think it's a legitimate one for this commission to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Giarrusso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, if the ACLU flat out opposes a constitutional convention, I mean, would that be safe to assume that you think everything's good right now and we have no need to change course at all?
Not at all. I don't believe that. I don't believe that in the least. The question is whether the benefits of the Constitutional Convention and the possible adverse outcomes that could flow from that outweigh the other methods that are available now. I understand the frustration of many people on some of the particular issues in which they'd like to see a convention. I certainly do. But keep in mind, the General Assembly itself has passed a number of constitutional amendments in the past addressing their powers. It may have taken longer than a lot of people would like, understandably so, but it's been done. It's worth noting that 3 of the government reform amendments that came out of the 1986 convention were voted down by the voters and then later approved when the General Assembly itself brought them to the public through the constitutional amendment process of the General Assembly. So there certainly is a history out there of being able to make use of other methods that don't have the sorts of dangers that we think exist with a constitutional convention.
Because if you're just simply looking at what the pitfalls could be, it seems like it's just throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And the other thing you mentioned about the other things that could go wrong, immigration or abortion or whatever, it's kind of, you're going on the assumption that the makeup of this delegation is going to be all these people from the backwoods with guns and whiskey bottles in their hands. I mean, I think they'll be pretty much a representative. They'll represent wherever they're from. We're not going to pick one demographic.
I certainly don't think it's one demographic that is involved in these issues. And again, I think a page of history is worth a volume of logic. We have the history here in Rhode Island. Nobody in 1985 was talking about restricting women's rights to choose. Nobody was talking about restricting the rights of racial minorities. It was not on anybody's public agenda, at least, but those were the issues that, if they didn't predominate, certainly were an important part of the 1986 convention.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?